Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
We are the Stinemetz brothers, and this is the Pseudo Scholars Podcast, where we believe that science isn't just for scientists. We believe that science is for anyone with integrity who honestly wants to know more about the world. Each week, we grapple with our own reality by challenging what we think we already know about stuff.
We like asking all kinds of interesting questions. Questions like when, not if, blockchain is going to change the world, or which country out there has the best healthcare system that the United States should model in their next Reform Act, or even what is the world going to be better off in the hands of the millennials, and what does the social data say about that? We like asking all kinds of crazy questions, reading the research, doing the digging, and then hopefully everyone's going to leave more informed, stimulated, and inspired. And so today we're asking kind of a more serious question, and we really do a spectrum of topics on the Pseudo Scholars Podcast, but I'm framing it up right here. How likely is a major nuclear war in our lifetime?
It's a scary question. This is a very apocalyptic episode in some ways, but since I've been doing research for this over the last 3 weeks in preparation for the podcast, it's been a real wake-up call to me and recognizing that we are always just a few button pushes away and maybe a 30-minute delay away from launching a nuclear attack or having a launched nuclear attack strike our own homeland. So it's a scary topic, but we're going to dive into it.
Yeah, so give us a quick history, Shane, because the fact of the matter is, nuclear war and weapon systems, evolution and things like that, that's all over the news cycle right now. But it's really, important to have a good foundation in how nuclear war and the potential of it really kind of came on the scenes and how it's evolved.
Sure. So to get into the history, we have to go all the way back to the 40s, and we have to remember that the U.S. demonstrated the first destructive capabilities of the atomic bomb on 2 locations in Japan, as most people all remember or know about, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that was in 1945. But the big aspect of that wasn't just necessarily that it encouraged the Japanese to surrender, but what came after that. That was the first demonstration of those powers, and a massive arms race ensued. So basically, I feel comfortable saying that developing a nuclear bomb became the #1 priority of every major nation state in the world, because people saw, holy shit, look what just happened to Japan. This could happen to us if we don't get one first and then have the ability to deter someone from launching one on us. So naturally, the Russians were kind of the growing enemy of the United States during the Cold War era, right after World War II. And it was in 1949 when the Russians developed their first bomb. And I would say that is when the Cold War really kicked off, because now you have 2 major superpowers that possess the ability to destroy each other by simply pressing a button. Or at least that was the thought at the time. It turns out the Russians probably didn't have the same capabilities we did to launch a massive attack on the United States, but we all felt that we did, and they certainly had launched nuclear weapons successfully and could have done some damage. So you have to remember. Oh, go ahead.
Well, so maybe it was a little bit far-fetched in terms of our understanding, but it's kind of, what is the guy on the other side of the chessboard? What does he have? And there's that mystery that's really interesting. But for people that don't understand, and it's obviously very challenging for us to understand the relationship that the U.S. had with Russia because we didn't grow up in that time period. But even shows like The Wonder Years that are capturing the 60s and 70s of growing up in kind of suburban America, you see in John F. Kennedy Jr. High School, all the kids hearing the alarm go off and they're diving under their desks preparing for, a Russian nuclear strike. So, it was that big a part of the culture that it was happening in schools, and really everyone in the United States was talking about this. So, it was very real.
That's right. And that's the era that our parents grew up in. And I think they believed that there was always a chance that the US and Soviet Russia, I know we're saying Russia, but it was really the Soviet Union at the time, Soviet Russia, were always on the brink of war with each other. And we never came closer than we did during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And arguably, this was the closest the world has ever come to destroying itself. I mean, a nuclear war was narrowly avoided by last-minute negotiations and diplomacy between the president of Russia at the time, the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, and John F. Kennedy in the United States. But that was just one example of how we narrowly avoided going into all-out nuclear war, which potentially could have led to a nuclear holocaust. Who really knows? But Now, in the current era, we feel that capitalism has outlasted communism. There was a slow demise of the Soviet Union really after that period of Nikita Khrushchev's reign, kind of after the Cuban Missile Crisis era. And so the world seemed to take a step back from going on to the brink of nuclear war. But I would still say that the fear of a nuclear war keeps some Americans and maybe even Russians awake at night, or at least keeps them concerned. And I've become one of those people since doing all the research for this podcast, as I said. And it part and parcel goes to the fact, Cade, that I think that human beings generally suck at assessing risk, and we just stay in our little lanes and in our scopes. And because right now it doesn't seem like anybody's going to drop an atomic bomb on our homelands, we seem to forget. The best example or analogy to this would be when you've had a car accident, and God knows I've had a bunch of them. When you have a car accident, like right afterwards, you're super nervous on the road. You got your hands at 10 and 2, you turn the radio off, you're constantly checking the rear view mirror, and you just feel skittish and nervous. But give it about a month. Then you're back to texting and driving and speeding and changing lanes without signaling, all these terrible habits. And it's not because the risk of getting into another car accident has gone down. In fact, it's probably gone up since you're less attentive now. But we've just started to become more comfortable, and it feels like it's out of sight and it's out of mind, the likelihood of another crash. And I would say that's exactly where we stand today when it comes to the state of the nuclear arms race around the world. It's out of sight, it's out of mind for most Americans and maybe anybody listening to the podcast today. But the likelihood of getting into another car crash is steadily going up.
Right. And it's just part of human nature to try to normalize ourselves into our surroundings and try to make sense of our worlds. And so dealing with chaotic situations is something human beings have always done, and it becomes normal over time. And what we're trying to say is not necessarily that we want everyone not sleeping at night, but it is something to be really aware of. And so with that, let's just get into it, right? What is the current state of nuclear weapons in the world, and how big of a risk is this, right? So point number one, every major world power has embraced capitalistic ideas since the demise of the Soviet Union.
And that's a big deal because sadly, it means there are a lot more nuclear powers out there. We went from having one capitalist state with a monopoly on nuclear weapons, that was the United States of America, and now we have closer to 8 to 10 superpowers, depending on who you ask, that possess nuclear weapons and the capabilities of launching them. So we should just cover those because we do want to get into the weeds a bit today. Obviously, the United States still has weapons, as do the Russians. But not so long after the Russians, the United Kingdom developed nuclear weapons. Then the French came and got involved. And then I'm not exactly sure in which order this happened, but the Chinese, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the North Koreans, and probably the Israelis, I was going to say Israelites, probably even the Israelis have nuclear powers as well, although they've never confirmed that. So it's kind of a secretive thing, but most likely experts all believe and analysts believe the Israelis have nuclear weapons as well. Then there's question marks about Iran. I mean, even though we're supposed to have prevented them from developing further tests and stuff, there are some suspicions that Iran may have nuclear weapons. And then the suspicion continues and goes pretty deep, and maybe Iraq still has nuclear weapons, right? We can ask George W. about that. But there's at least 8 to 10 nuclear powers that have nuclear weapons today, Cade.
Right. And capitalism is really just about competition. And so this is not just about economic competition, but, competition to survive. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, the survival of culture and societies, and of course, just human lives as well, right? So point number 3, the U.S. has spent roughly $9 trillion on developing nuclear weapons in their nuclear programs during the Cold War, and developed almost 50,000 nuclear warheads. So when we started to kind of double down in this space during the Cold War, maybe doubling down is a little bit of an understatement. 50,000 nuclear warheads, because really we were just trying to build up our nuclear capital so that we could control the situation as best as we could.
Yeah, at one point we had fewer nuclear weapons, and we still may have fewer nuclear weapons than the Russians, who had something like 70,000. But you also have to compare the capabilities of those weapons. So we have tactical nuclear weapons that could be fired from the shoulder. And then we have the most extreme nuclear weapons. So when we're talking about the state of nuclear weapons today versus what it was in 1945, nothing is more important than the discussion about thermonuclear weapons. We're talking about the H-bomb, the super bomb, the hydrogen bomb that is hundreds of times more devastating than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan twice. So now we possess that, and just about all those other countries that I spoke of possess thermonuclear weapons, which is the next level.
Right, right, and it's not just enough to have, you know, this vast majority of the nuclear warheads in the world, or like a really, you know, sophisticated arsenal. You also have to have like a delivery system for them, right? Because geographically, it becomes challenging to, you know, identify targets and strike them from long distances. And so what they're called is intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, is kind of the way that you'll hear it on the news and things like that. But they're the primary means for this, the mechanism for getting these warheads and identifying them and shooting them at a target and causing, you know, massive destruction. And so current ICBM technology gives thermonuclear warheads like an outstanding range. I think it's somewhere like 8,700 miles. And so the reason why that's a bit sobering, but also a little comforting if you're, you know, in the United States, because of, you know, being protected by a couple of different oceans, we can strike Moscow, Shanghai, and North Korea from anywhere in the U.S. at any time. And so it's really kind of an interesting technological advancements that we've seen in this space in the last several years, where all of a sudden, you know, the world is becoming much smaller in terms of our capability to usher in destruction at any point in time.
And we've demonstrated here that many more countries have the capability of carrying out a nuclear strike. So the state of the affairs today is just much different than it was in the heyday of the nuclear era. We just probably pay much less attention to it because it doesn't feel like there's going to be a strike anytime soon. But we do need to talk about what could cause a strike, Cade. So in this next section, let's break down the two, I guess, options or potential routes towards an atomic strike that could occur according to academic experts. So all of the research that we've done here is based off of academic and analyst reports, expertise in the nuclear field, people who are analyzing the likelihood of these sort of things on a regular basis for their jobs, for organizations like the RAND Corporation, where I got a lot of our comments today and some of our resources. So there's really two ways that experts say a nuclear strike could happen. The first is a state versus state nuclear attack. This is the one that we would think most about, the Russia versus the United States outcome. Basically, you've got tensions between two nuclear states escalating to a point where the slightest thing could tip the scale and cause somebody to launch a weapon, like a miscommunication, like a technical failure, like a bluff. All of these sort of things are going on between nuclear states all of the time behind the scenes and could cause a trigger and start a launch. So that's option number one. And then option number two, which wouldn't have felt very scary up until maybe the last decade or so since 9/11, but the likelihood that a terrorist organization acquires nuclear weapons, obviously a non-rational, non-state actor that would love to have weapons to carry out jihad and many of their other missions around the world. So a terrorist organization could get their hands on these weapons potentially and demonstrate them. But let's dive into those, Cade, and let's talk about what it looks like. What are the most likely outcomes when we're talking about a state versus state nuclear attack?
Yeah, and just one other thing on the terrorist organizations potentially, you know, stealing one of these, that's unthinkable. That is infinitely more scary to me than any of the scenarios that we're going to talk about, but probably less likely, which is why we're really focused more on the state versus state. And that's what we're seeing kind of ramp up in tensions, you know, rise a lot in the last several years. But kind of what I picture, Shane, in this state versus state, not to be, you know, comical or anything like that, but I think about like an old Western standoff, right? These two guys that are sitting out and they're just looking at each other, and they both have their hands in their holsters on their gun. They're ready to, in just a couple seconds, they could kill the other guy, but they're not completely sure of what the other guy is going to do, right? So you kind of have this stalemate, but it also feels very volatile, even though we haven't seen anyone, you know, use it in such a long period of time. So it's really, when we talk about state versus state nuclear attacks, we're talking about a kind of a use it or lose it scenario. And that's the worst case scenario, according to all these analysts, because, you know, it just kind of builds with momentum, and all of a sudden the destruction capabilities just go through the roof. But like a regional nuclear power that relies on nuclear power security from invasion, and so therefore they could be provoked really easily, right? We're basically saying, I'm going to store up my weapons on my side, you're going to store up your weapons on your side, so just in case we need to use it, we can. But the problem is, when are you going to use it? And if you don't use it, do you lose it? And all of a sudden, does that apply a lot of pressure to these state actors to say, well, I don't want to just be the guy responding, because if I respond, it's probably too late because of how, you know, destructive these mechanisms can be. So that's kind of what we're talking about with this state versus state. It's a very delicate type of standoff that we see.
And there are several potential outcomes that experts are talking about when they discuss two nuclear powers that might go head to head in a nuclear war. So some that stand out to people that know a lot about foreign policy and understand geopolitics, these are going to be pretty obvious, but they're interesting to talk about nonetheless. So number one on actually every expert list is India and Pakistan right now. People don't know much about the tensions there and the nuclear powers and their tension over the Kashmir border region that they share. Technically, the state of India still believes that Pakistan and India are at war together, and there's a ton of turmoil in Pakistan right now. The Pakistani Taliban is becoming more and more powerful, so just imagine those guys and their influence on heads of state in the Pakistani government. It's pretty scary, but you could think of a situation where India gets some intelligence that the Pakistani Taliban is going to overthrow the Pakistani government and all of a sudden have access to those nuclear launch codes, and India getting a little skittish and out of survival instincts launching first. Something along those lines. So that's the India-Pakistan situation, something that's worth reading about and digging into if you're not familiar. One that people are, at least Americans, are far more familiar with would be the Iran and Israel solution or outcome. And that's one that experts push quite a bit further down the likelihood of a nuclear strike happening, but it's still an interesting one. There's basically probably no deeper hatred in the world between two nations, I'd say, than Iran and Israel, and the hate is mutual. So just think of a case where Iran, who generally has a tendency to respond big time when threatened, because they feel surrounded, and they are surrounded geographically by all of these Arab states, Sunni and Shia alike, that aren't allies with them, and they've got a sense of animosity towards other countries, and one of those countries is Iran. And Iran, despite having agreed to a massive nuclear deal with the United States and other major powers, saying that they're not going to deliver or develop nuclear powers for the next 15 years, is probably not a commitment that Israel takes too seriously, in all honesty. I've read a few Israeli reports that believe that the Iranians still have the ability to develop nuclear weapons in just a few quick years' time if they wanted to reinitiate some of these reactors and get going again, or if they were doing it in secret. So it's not too far-fetched to think that Iran and Israel could spar off in a nuclear war at some point in our lifetime.
Yeah, and why would the Israelis believe that, right? Like, this is such a complex, delicate situation, assigning probabilities. You're dealing with so many variables and a political landscape that could change, almost instantaneously because of the state of our world now. So, I don't blame the Israelis at all there. And it's kind of like, okay, who's signing up to not develop their nuclear weapons programs, and how do you actually enforce that, right? It's extremely challenging. And so these are the kinds of problems that are really complex and will take a long time to solve. But anyways, last scenario, Shane, probably the most common one that people are familiar with, and that's North Korea and US. Right, and that's all over the news cycle right now is, all these missile tests that North Korea has been launching, and kind of how volatile are they? What are they willing to do? And what are the implications on the U.S. and how will Trump respond? Right, but just to understand a little bit about the North Korean situation, right? So North Korea is right on the border of South Korea, and really the two capital cities are only several miles apart, and they're kind of separated by that DMZ line. And ever since the 50s, as the Korean War started, essentially the North Korean peninsula, or the North Korean country, is still trying to reunite the peninsula. So Kim Jong, right, who's the leader of the North Koreans, is kind of thought of as this divinely benevolent dictator that was given by the gods to lead the North Korean people. And so it's still part of North Korean policy to try to unify the whole peninsula. So it's a very volatile situation. But obviously, because they've been so isolationist, they've also been putting a ton of money into developing their nuclear weapons. And so as we see their isolationist type of strategy, it's very hard to understand what exactly they're willing to do and how tied are they to economic values and things like that. So really the challenging thing about North Korea is just we don't know what they're going to do, right? They're completely estranged from the rest of the world. And so that's obviously the one that is most concerning to the U.S. because they have shown, great resistance to the U.S. trying to flex their muscles, and that, they've sunk a South Korean warship in the last couple of years and killed a lot of folks. And then also probably worth mentioning just that there are 30,000 Americans just a few miles away from the DMZ located in Seoul. And since we have, alliances with South Korea, that puts the U.S. in a little bit of a touchy space in a war that we would not want to get into.
It's a truly unique challenge, the one of North Korea and the United States today. I liked what Christopher Hitchens says, one of my great heroes, when summarizing like North Korean leadership. It's a little bit offensive, but he called them racist, mythologist dwarfs. And this is like a famous phrase that he used to say. But it's true in the sense that they are probably the most racist culture left alive today. They are truly homogenous, and they believe they're the purest race of all races, and they don't believe in intermixing their races. So they have a racist persona. I mean, they're mythologists because they believe that Kim Jong-un is divinely chosen to defend their bloodline, and that he's a direct descendant of some god creature. I mean, they have all kinds of religious ties to their leaders. And that's a scary thing in many ways, because they're more willing to trust, and they're more willing to follow his leadership if they think he's divine and all-knowing and all-being. And then he calls them dwarfs just to top it off, which is pretty funny because it's interesting to point out, like, over the last, I don't know, it's really been since World War II that the peninsula was divided, but their genetics have taken a real back step from what the South Koreans have in terms of genetics. And they're actually about 3 inches taller than 3 inches shorter than South Koreans on average. So despite the fact that they think they're the purest bloodline, they actually don't have particularly strong genetics. They die at an earlier age, as far as we can understand. But you're right, Cade, that they are just a unique challenge because they're so cut off from the rest of the world. They're so unpredictable. And Kim Jong-un seems to be fairly irrational. But the scariest comment about the North Koreans today is that despite the fact that they don't have the ability to launch a nuclear attack on the U.S. right now, you're right that they could obliterate Seoul just a few hundred miles from their location. But it's expected now, analysts have predicted, that in Donald Trump's term frame as president, they will have the ability to launch ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, from North Korea to LA in under or around 30 minutes. And that's before the end of Donald Trump's presidency. So it's becoming a more important topic, and there's headlines every day as it relates to the North Koreans.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting situation to see how the Donald tries to deal with it. But I don't envy any president that has to deal with a country like that, because it's, it's kind of an interesting analogy, but if you remember one of the Batman movies, Batman and the Joker just seems like this invincible evil person because he doesn't care about anything. He doesn't care about money. He doesn't care about power. He doesn't care about anything. He just kind of is kind of wicked and destructive. And I'm not sure that we can place Kim Jong totally into that mind frame. I know he's a human being. He wants to survive. He wants to have power, but it's just interesting because the ability to influence him seems smaller than what we've seen with other big political actors, just because of our ability to economically divide him against other people. Well, it doesn't matter. He doesn't care about his people, right? So it's just a challenging situation.
It is. And then there are two other major ones that are out there right now that are obviously challenging, both associated with the United States. Russia would come to mind. We've done a long-term standoff with the Russians. We're not going to cover that one today, Cade. That might be a topic for a whole nother time, the Russian involvement in the United States today and the way that relationships are developing. But that's obviously one. And the Chinese are left out there as well with nuclear weapons. And while we don't consider them an enemy, they're certainly a threat to global dominance. And we don't know what's going to come in the next 10 to 20 years. But a lot of experts and analysts do believe that because of the growing GDP in China and the decreasing one in Russia, there'll be much more of a conflict between the United States and Chinese influences, and Russia will become less and less important. But that's a conversation for another day.
Right. So we're really heading into this era of nuclear terrorism, right? So we've heard about terrorism for a really, really, really long time, but as nuclear weapons have proliferated, we kind of have to combine these things and say, okay, how does this new concept of being able to use nuclear weapons to cause terror all over the world, how's that going to impact our societies, right? So it's really, we define it as, non-rational state actors, right? So people that are not rational, who'd love to pull off a nuclear strike, but don't have the resources. That might be organizations like ISIS or, the Taliban. Yeah, groups like that, right? So talk us through, Shane, what does it take for some of those types of places to develop this kind of structure?
I've learned the most about how nuclear weapons and nuclear projects work by investigating this side of the house. It's been pretty interesting. You basically need two things. You need really, really capable physicists, and then you need lots of equipment and some fissile material. So to get the capable physicists, that's an easy one. Like, let's just take the example of ISIS for the moment. I mean, we know for a fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia have dozens, if not hundreds, of capable physicists that can do the necessary calculations, can set up whatever would be required to get nuclear reactors up and running. So you just need a few of those guys who are either incentivized financially to do this for you, or whose idealisms align with ISIS. And to be honest, that's not too far-fetched, in my opinion, in terms of some of the characters that are running around Iran and Saudi Arabia these days, just when you think about the fact that Osama bin Laden, the greatest terrorist of, I guess, at least the last 100 years, came from Saudi Arabia and was a rich guy from Saudi Arabia. So radical Islam doesn't seem so rare in the world these days, and convincing a few physicists that you need to get involved with this project could be possible. So that's step one, getting some physicists. Not too difficult. But step two, Cade, is pretty hard. You need a lot of equipment and you need fissile material. So to get the equipment is not incredibly difficult. You need specialized centrifuges where you can enrich uranium, and then you have to be able to specialize a reactor for plutonium-239. Basically, all that means, for the intents and purposes of this conversation, is that you're going to need a lot of space to store this equipment. That equipment is not impossible to get by any stretch. We're going to require a lot of space, potentially dozens of acres of land somewhere to build and establish this site. And that's something that's not going to go unnoticed. You know, the United States is going to be flying spy planes, and satellites are going to detect that. And we've got all kinds of other intelligence assets that are out there in the world right now that would be trying to identify something like this happening before it happens. So that's a pretty big challenge. But then the next big challenge is acquiring fissile material. In order to acquire fissile material, you can really only do one of three things. You either got to just steal it, you got to have an insider, a double agent, or you have to have it given to you. So to outright steal it, now we're talking about ISIS breaking into a facility with fissile material, winning a gun battle, and then exiting with the fissile material. I mean, it sounds like something from a James Bond film. It doesn't seem highly likely. I've researched and learned that all of the locations, at least in the United States, where fissile material are stored are obviously heavily guarded and secure. It would be very hard to get out alive. And even if you did, you'd be tracked down within a short period of time. And who knows, maybe at that point, the United States would say, okay, we're going to nuke you with tactical missiles because you've now taken fissile material. That's just too dangerous. So the likelihood of option one is pretty low. Option two, Kate, is about using an insider. This seems like the most logical solution. You get a double agent. You get somebody with terrorist sympathies, again, to smuggle out the material. And the material doesn't have to take a huge amount of space. I guess you could have like a single truck or a few trucks. So if you had an insider at the gate and you had an insider inside the facility, maybe you could smuggle out some fissile material from another site somewhere in the Middle East, like in Iran, Israel seems pretty far stretched, but maybe Israel, maybe France, where there's a large influence in terrorist organizations. So maybe one of those is possible. And then lastly, Cade, you got option number three. And this is where the state actor just literally gives you the fissile material because they want you to carry out a strike on their behalf. This is the one that people would be very scared about if Iran got their hands on nuclear weapons, or any of the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, or anyways, without going into more detail on those. It's scary to think about the fact that someone with potential affiliations with a terrorist organization might hand it over for free. And then with those two capabilities, some physicists and some fissile material, you can be up and running.
Right. It's amazing how quickly, this could all change. Let's hope and pray that option number three, because that seems like one of the quickest, most volatile ways to escalate something like this could arise. But I guess, Shane, we're really asking these questions and talking about this topic because we think that the risks of a nuclear attack are rising today, right? At least relative to what they were 50 years ago, not just because we've talked about the advancements in technology and all these other countries in addition to the US and Russia now have these capabilities, but also because really our political environment seems to be changing in a way that's pretty unique in the last several years. So really the world seems to be deprioritizing our post-World War II liberal values of like international cooperation and free trade, where post-World War II, right, everyone is worried about building up their economies. We all have things to offer to the world in forms of technology, manufacturing. We're kind of agreeing to cooperate in these mutually beneficial ways to try to develop our economic structures, right? But it seems like things are changing a little bit since we've avoided nuclear war over the last 70 years. And that's really the rise of right-wing and not just, we don't mean right-wing Republican, but kind of these populist nationalisms in the West, right? We're talking about kind of Trump's, put America first. We don't want to get involved in the rest of the world. And if we do, it's because we're going to flex our muscles a little bit. We see the Trump movement in the United States being pretty powerful. Russia and Putin are pretty obvious, right? That, the former KGB officer is so beloved because of his ability and desire to put Russia back on the map as the supreme world power. You also have, rising right-wing parties in Netherlands, France, and Germany. And that's really changing Europe. And then you've also seen the ripple effect of UK leaving the European Union in the Brexit movement. And so really you kind of see synergies being built in all of these different political movements that lead you to think that maybe countries are becoming a little less cooperative and a little more isolated. And that's what makes this kind of lack of exchange of information and transparency about our nuclear weapons a little more dangerous, because we really get into, kind of game theory strategy here, where you're not exactly exposed to the information on the other side of the wall. And so it makes how you respond to those situations more challenging and more costly.
And on the home front, you mentioned Donald Trump. I think it's worth diving into it just a little bit because it is a scary factor for me as far as I can evaluate this. We now have a president who, in my opinion, not everyone will agree with this, but on this podcast, we do share our opinions, seems to behave like an uncontrollable wrecking ball. I mean, we've got 7 to 8 months of him in now, and he just seems to kind of smash randomly from stuff to stuff. And from my vantage point, he just seems very emotional, very reactive. I think he's probably the best example of an egomaniac that I could think of. If I had to describe what an egomaniac is to a person, I would think of the United States president at this point. That doesn't mean that he's a bad president. I'm not saying that he's going to necessarily have a bad record as president, but he's probably the least strategic and diplomatic president in U.S. history. And when we're talking about nuclear weapons, one of these resounding themes that we keep coming back to is strategy, is diplomacy, is this master game of chess. I think it's worth recalling that my favorite scientist, John von Neumann, who some people have said is the smartest man of the 20th century, some have said the smartest man that ever lived, he actually invented practices like game theory, which we covered, by the way, in episode 8 and 9 of the Pseudo Scholars podcast, if you want to know more about game theory. But other concepts like the prisoner's dilemma, he came up with these ideas to help President Truman in the 40s negotiating this very monotonous and also complex nuclear arms race with Russia. And it worked. I mean, we have not gone into nuclear war yet, and largely because of these ideas like game theory and the prisoner's dilemma, where we're evaluating probabilities of outcomes. And to me, I get a little bit concerned by the fact that I don't think Donald Trump has any clue what game theory is or represents. I don't think he understands the history of the way that the arms race occurred. I mean, he's a guy who regularly brags about the fact that he doesn't read books. I just don't feel a lot of confidence with him at the helm. Now, I will take a step back and say that I'm more thankful by the fact that his closest advisor is the greatest military general of my generation, General Mattis, and that guy is a master practitioner of game theory. I know that personally, or I don't know about know it personally, but I've certainly read that. So it gives me a little bit more confidence. But overall, Cade, that does make for a bit of a scarier current climate in the nuclear race when we're talking about a president that doesn't seem to have that strategic and diplomatic mind about himself.
Right, and we're speculating here a little bit. I mean, that's all we can do, right? We're speculating based on the information that we do have and the perceptions that we've experienced through the media and things like that. So I guess it boils down to the question of, has he played this kind of populist theme song during his campaign and then into his presidency here, merely to appeal to American values. Because the fact of the matter is that that's where a lot of Americans were, right? They wanted to put America first. They wanted to get out of involvement in the Middle East and things like that. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but it's probably a less educated opinion, and to some degree, because when you understand how connected we are politically and economically and militaristically with the rest of the world, you understand why America has to be a leader. But the question is that just something that a strategy that Trump is playing because he knew it would get him votes and he knew it kind of keeps his support base maybe for a re-election in the next several years? Or is he really a firm believer in that? Will he really act on that kind of thinking? And obviously we know that he's surrounded himself with some brilliant military generals, Mad Dog Mattis, who you've already mentioned, but also John Kelly, who being promoted to, a high-level advisor inside the White House, chief of staff. And so, yep. Right. So we know that he's surrounded himself with some very rational players that have tons of experience in this era. But I guess it's, we kind of have to place our faith a little bit in those guys being able to balance out the rhetoric that Donald Trump, right? We don't know what he actually believes about things, and that's probably not a great quality to have as a president, that it's hard to know what you really honestly think about things. But I guess that's kind of me trying to sober us up a little bit, because it is a little bit scary how volatile he can be and some of the things that he says. And that's always been a talking point of the Democrats, in the election was hey, you want this guy having the nuclear codes? And that probably wasn't something people paid a ton of attention to. And all of a sudden, the Pseudo Scholars podcast is bringing it to light.
Right. And despite the fact that maybe in some ways he's benefited our own economy, I mean, I'm not seeing GDP rise, but we can talk about that another time. Despite the fact that maybe that voter base that you talked about feels like their concerns have been heard, and he's going to focus on bringing jobs back to the United States and do all of those things that seem to be really good in that venue, what it's done is alienated the rest of the world by pulling out of climate negotiations, by swinging this wrecking ball from place to place across the globe. Now he's divided with Congress on how to handle Russia. Britain doesn't even want him to step foot in his city of London. Our greatest ally won't even host him. So he's not exactly a guy that's got a lot of clout, I would say, on the world stage right now. In many ways, seems to me that he's being made a fool of, but we'll see how it all plays out. We don't want to jump to conclusions necessarily. And I am glad that we have Mad Dog Mattis in there. He's been to Japan and Korea already, our allies who are obviously the most concerned with a rise in North Korea's nuclear arms situation. And he's gone there and he's told them that we're committed to staying the course in our agreements, because there are many global agreements, as we talked about, these post-World War II agreements that the United States developed and incorporated, that Trump is now saying that we're not going to be involved in, that we're going to start renegotiating our protection commitments around the world. He said that several times. Mad Dog has gone completely on the other side of things and has gone to Japan and Korea and said, actually, we're not doing that. We are going to sustain our commitments. So it is this very strange situation. Maybe it's a massive strategy, and he's the ultimate game theorist, Cade, and we just don't realize it. But it seems a little bit unlikely, as he's also said that we're not going to renew the START treaty, with Russia, which was this treaty that says we are going to limit nuclear stockpiles and we're going to start moving towards disarmament, which is the most commonly held position amongst nuclear experts, that we should be moving closer and closer towards disarmament. Trump's position is that we're going to expand and modernize our nuclear arsenal. So we've got a lot of things that are going on geopolitically right now as it relates to the arms race. Trump is a massive play in this because he's got control over the most potent nuclear arsenal in the world.
Yeah, and it's really important to note here, and this was not something that I understood completely. It's probably a little gray to a lot of people, but can Trump just press the button whenever he wants to? How exactly does that work? And we're here to state that, quote, the President of the United States does indeed have the sole authority to launch the American nuclear arsenal on any target at any time for any reason without the permission of Congress. Now, we're talking about kind of institutional mechanisms. So we're saying there's no barrier legislatively that prevents Trump from having that kind of authority. But there are lots of other kind of invisible barriers that are out there, such as, the Secretary of Defense, his greatest advisor in this space, seeing things a little bit differently and ultimately being the one that has to carry out the order anyways. And so there are some barriers, but it is a little bit crazy to think that we've placed all of that power into the hands of one person. And when you think about it, our democracy is really founded on the presupposition that men abuse power. I mean, that's the case, and that we don't think that monarchies are the best way, and we wanted to break away from, the English and the Revolutionary War and things like that. So to not democratize that kind of power, the power to press the button and end the game, seems to be the kind of the ultimate power here. So anyways, it's pretty crazy to think about.
Yeah, Cade, you were quoting a Rand analyst who's had a lot to say about nuclear policy, and we were reading some of his work before this. I can't remember his name. We maybe should have noted that, but that's who you were quoting earlier. And another quote that he has here is that there are no procedural or institutional mechanisms that can stop a president, a U.S. president, from giving an order to use nuclear weapons. So that's a person who's an expert on the law, who's an expert on the policy and general strategy around nuclear weapons. So the nuclear football that gets carried around wherever the president goes, as he sleeps in the White House, this guy is awake one floor below him, and they actually routinely practice the sprint up to the Oval Office, or wherever the president sleeps, I should say, and moving into Trump's bedroom quickly and seeing what the timeline is between the time that it takes for him to get the call to get into Trump's room, so that Trump could actually execute something using the nuclear launch codes placed inside that black briefcase that we know as the football. So you're absolutely right, Cade, that there doesn't seem to be any institutional mechanism to stop a little bit of a crazy guy from overreacting. Or I know in the past there have been a lot of concerns about leaders in Russia who enjoyed their vodka in the evenings. Imagine a gentleman like that who's hopped up on vodka in the night having control over the Russian nuclear arsenal. And Putin has that exact power in Russia. So it's very scary to think that a single individual has that sort of authority. And I think we can agree today that that policy has got to change. I mean, it was instituted for reactive measures. It would take too long to get Congress together and react in the event that somebody else strikes us. So we have to strike first, or we'd have to strike within seconds. So you got to give the president quick access. I get that argument to some degree, but I'm just not comfortable as a U.S. citizen having a policy in place that lets Donald Trump have complete control over the nuclear codes and give them the ability to launch an attack that hits 8,700 miles from home anywhere on the planet at the same time. I mean, that is a very scary thing.
Yeah, but interesting point. 70 years, no more nuclear attacks that have taken place since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So there's something about the current system, as seemingly flawed as it may be, or as it seems like it's just really ramping up and becoming more delicate every single day. But there is something to be said about the fact that we've gone this period of time without anything happening. And so, I think it's the game theory that's going on, right? It's the idea that everyone wants to survive, and they realize that by pressing the button, they're going to bring a ton of destruction onto not only themselves, but the rest of the world. So it's just very interesting, because this is not a battle of technology. I don't think, at least in the next 20 years, the technology will be there, right? It's really more of like a battle of ideas and values. And that's where I think you and I both agree that the United States needs to be the leader in that space. But it's very, very challenging. As Trump says, I want to develop our arsenal, that's the game theory in him, right? Saying that, well, if they have it on the other side, what protects us? And so it's just a very challenging question, probably more challenging than anything we've talked about on the Pseudo Scholars, and the implications are probably much more vast and much more expansive in their reaches. But to be fair, right, this wasn't a huge issue in the election, even though it was made to be so by the Democrats. The voters didn't take a huge they didn't place a ton of importance on thinking whether or not Trump having the power to press the button was going to be a big deal. Maybe they think a little bit differently in 7 months later, as the situation with North Korea really seems to be getting a little bit out of control and heading towards a decision being made. Because the fact of the matter is, we can't stay in a stalemate forever, right? Eventually, someone's going to pull the trigger. And so it's just when, not if, and how are we going to respond? But, for those out there that don't know a ton about the, nuclear weapons, unfortunately, there's not a ton that you as an individual can do about it, except for maybe in subsequent elections, really thinking more about it, because it probably should be a bigger issue that the regular voter is thinking about. But, we do have a system. We've placed our trust into the democracy of the United States, and it has led us well for the last 70 years. And albeit we have a kind of a a unique president that we've never really observed someone like him before, but we do know that he has surrounded himself with some brilliant rational actors in this space. And so kind of just the hope is that power is balanced at least somewhat, and then we can, kind of rest easy at night a little bit, thinking that we do have some people thinking for our greater good.
I'm glad to hear that. That is a reassuring statement. Maybe I'm a little bit of a naysayer in this space, because it is something that's a bit scary when we're talking about a nuclear holocaust. If you ask physicists around the world about what the greatest likelihood of human civilization destroying itself, they don't choose meteor. They choose nuclear holocaust. It's the number one selection by the World Physics Group. I forget what it's called, but I could share the article in the YouTube comments after this. People generally recognize that this is the best chance we have at destroying what we've built over the last tens of thousands of years as a human society. And giving all of the power into one person is pretty dangerous. And I'd say that there is one thing that Americans can do. You can't actually call your congressman about this, because there's a bill on the floor of the Congress right now that's being discussed and talked about and probably revised that would restrict the limitations of the president's power as it relates to nuclear launch codes.
Yeah, so that's a piece of action that we can all take away. But at the end of the day, it is so challenging for me to really see this issue as getting better over time, because it just seems like this is where technology is going. How are you going to cooperatively get all of these different people with? I mean, we're talking about completely different worldviews, completely different outlooks on life, completely different value systems to all agree to drop them in the ocean, or whatever it is that you have to do to get rid of your nuclear weapons. So how you control it, I hope that the brightest minds in America are being devoted to problems like these, because this is something that we've said, the reaches are just enormous.
Yeah, Kate, I want to close with a quote from Professor Raharaman, who's a professor of nuclear weapons strategy. And he's a guy that I read quite a bit in preparation for this podcast. He had a bit of a harrowing quote. When asked whether or not he thinks likelihood of nuclear weapons is going up or going down, when will it happen, all these predictions that people are trying to ask of him as he's a self-proclaimed expert on this topic, he says, hopefully nobody is crazy enough to drop one, a nuclear bomb, but nobody has the guts to get rid of them either. I think it's going to go on like this until something stupid happens. And that's a harrowing thought for us all. We can just collect our thoughts, I suppose, and try to figure out more confidently where we stand on this issue, and do our best as voters to influence this. I guess that's the best I can think of.
Yeah, but at least, hopefully we've done a little bit of our part to inform everyone out there of something that, we didn't know a ton about going into this topic, and this is the only way you can learn, is to read and research and chew on it a little bit. So, we'll all be more informed as we make decisions moving forward.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Cade. That's all I got for this week. I will see you later, little brother.
All right. See you, big brother.